So yes, this is what I'm going to be talking about today, although I have to start with a proviso that I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the actual bridge itself, and I'm inspired by Dr. Lowe's, President Lowe's discussion about building bridges. I'm going to be talking about a physical bridge that has been really front and center in American literature as well as Arabic literature. And just to give an indication, according to Dr. Salim's recent remark, that this literature from the time of the beginning of the 20th century continues to resonate and be important. We recently had Izzadin Fisher, who is currently a visiting professor at Dartmouth, come and talk about his 2012 highly regarded novel called Embrace on Brooklyn Bridge, to show you the continued relevance of the writings of people like Rihani, like Naimy, like Gibran, on Arabic literature, as well as their somewhat not appreciated place within American literature too. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the context of American literary responses to Brooklyn Bridge, which are important both physically and spiritually. And I'm also going to be talking about Rihani's place in that, which I think has been underappreciated. I'm looking forward to the fact that we may get a chance to publish these essays to go a little bit more into detail, but I'll try to keep to the time limit today. So I want to start by talking about Brooklyn Bridge itself. And as you can see, Ameen Rihani wrote which have had a tremendous influence throughout the Arab world. He wrote about Brooklyn Bridge and an amazingly interesting and creative response to that particular object, monument, if you will give me that. Brooklyn Bridge was a milestone of engineering when it opened in 1883, and it quickly became a staple symbol of American identity, an engineering marvel that also captured the imagination. Although perhaps not so immediately aesthetically entrancing as other great bridges in the United States, like the Golden Gate in San Francisco, Brooklyn Bridge has become synonymous with the technological vigor and the surprisingly soaring spirit of New Yorkers. I always love this combination of things New Yorkish in this regard. In his 1867 proposal, the bridge designer, John Roebling, of German origin, called for a suspension framework hung between two towers that he compared to a Gothic cathedral, thus calling attention to the practical and spiritual duality of the project. And this particular picture, I think, shows very nicely that Gothic aspect of the bridge behind. This is actually, I think, a picture not of John Roebling himself, but of his son, Washington Roebling, who actually oversaw the project to fruition and completion. Yet it's also important to note that from its inception, Brooklyn Bridge incorporated two levels for transport, a level for vehicles and a level for pedestrians. So there you can see the two together. In this, it was unique among American bridges. It gave freedom of movement both to the individual and to the group in the horse-drawn and motorized transport vehicles. And I would argue, and I will argue if we get a chance to redo this in more depth, that this gave free range to particular American fascination with catering to the needs of the personal and the collective at once. the pedestrian bridge and the motorized transport, or if you prefer, unity and individuality, not privileging one over the other. And this, I would argue, becomes the essence of the American idea of democracy, rather than rules and constitutions, which are definitely an important part of the democratic impulse that we find throughout the Arab world and in Europe and America, America to a lesser extent. America was always the place of triumph, of freedom of the individual. And I think that's essential to the concept of democracy in the work of all three of these authors, Rihani, Naimy, and Gibran as well. So the symbolic dimension of the bridge gradually caught the imagination of American literary figures, particularly American modernist poets and their successors. Maybe many of you are familiar with the modernist, American modernist Hart and his long poem, The Bridge, from 1930, in 8 sections or cantos, which is based on his experiences living and curating his poetic persona in the shadow of the iconic structure of the bridge. And the following excerpt, as you can see here, from the prologue to the poem, gives an accurate idea of its style. O harp and altar of the, I'm actually going to have to look at it, of the fury fused, how could mere toil align thy choiring strings? Terrific threshold of the prophet's pledge, prayer of pariah and the lover's cry, again the traffic lights that skim thy swift unfractioned idiom, immaculate sigh of stars, beating thy path, condense eternity, and we have seen night fill lifted in thine arms. So Crane's poem, which is fairly late, 1930, is showing us a very interesting kind of moving together of the ideas of various levels of ideas. So the form of this poem is an urgent personifying address to the bridge itself. In an archaic device known as prosopopoeia, that results at Hart's hands in an uneasy marriage between an evocation of all that is indicative of the poetic linguistic forms, like the vocative O, that we see over and over again in the poem, or the decidedly non-contemporary deployment of second-person singular addresses like thou, thy, and thine that you see up there in repeated constructions, conjoined with contemporary descriptors like traffic lights. So it's this juxtaposition that one sees so clearly in in Crane's poem, and the result of Crane's handiwork is a woven, quote, poetic texture of incredible density, unquote, that also generated a storm of poetic criticism when it appeared, dominated by the refrain that Crane had been, quote, tortured by history, unquote, and the theoretical quest for an overarching American mythic narrative that sacrificed the rhythms of daily life and the spontaneity of the American idiom. So what is interesting to take away from this is that by the 1930s, by the period of high modernism, there was an increasingly mixed response that was very uncertain and very ambiguous about what the bridge actually meant. And we can see this in poems like Federico Garcia Lorca's poem, The City That Never Sleeps, which is from the same year, which denounces the bridge as a tool of oppression, since it was built by poor workers who died in its construction. And what we sometimes forget in the construction of the bridge is that it required feats of daring do that frequently resulted in people dying. And as you can see there on the right-hand side as well, the caissons that anchor the bridge resulted in the death of the workers workers, quite frequently because of the poor air and the poor pressurization of the caissons that they were working in to get to the bedrock of the East River. So by the time we see Lorca and Crane writing, they denounce the bridge as a tool of oppression, since it was built by the poor workers who died in the construction. And this carries through to the work of the beat poet Jack Kerouac, who wrote Brooklyn Bridge Blues in 1956, which pursues a similar theme. And one of my favorites, Marianne Moore, who is a famous American high modernist poet. And she talks about the bridge as, "O caged Circe of steel and stone, her parent German ingenuity, O catenary curve from tower to pier, implacable enemy of the mind's deformity, of man's uncompunctuous greed, his crass love of crass priority, just recently obstructing acquiescent feet." Here she's talking about the immigrants and their experience coming ashore. She sees the bridge as a block to that. She says as well, "They are about to step ashore when darkness fell without a cause, as if probity had not joined our cities in the sea." So she is very obscurely and obliquely, but to be sure, lamenting the sacrifices that the bridge entailed in her own poem. And like Crane's The Bridge, all of these later 20th century poems are bound together, however, by one common feature. They bear the mark of influence by the one great American poet who never wrote a sustained poem about the Brooklyn Bridge, yet might most logically have been proposed to have done so, Walt Whitman. So Whitman was the poet of Brooklyn. Whoops. Go to him. There we go. Whitman was the poet of Brooklyn, having lived there most of his life, and in 1856 he published a poem called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry that celebrated the old ferry and its colorful gathering of characters, which plied the East River to Manhattan, a service that would soon be supplanted by the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883. And those of you who've read my earlier work on Rihani may actually remember that I talked in that article about Rihani's incorporation of the prose poetry principles that Whitman uses in his writing. And so here you see an example from the very beginning of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which kind of shows this different view of what the Brooklyn Bridge can mean, or what Brooklyn as a suburb of New York, of Manhattan, and the ferry can mean. "Flood tide below me," he said. "I see you face to face, clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high. I see you also face to face. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. And you shall cross from shore to shore, hence, are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose." So Whitman's poem could therefore be said to be invested in the older sense of many yet one, community that would no longer be the norm once the ferry was replaced by a bridge that offered a very different experience. There are suggestions that Whitman was not comfortable with this change in transportation in New York and the abandonment of the ferries. This was a posture not generally in accord with his usual celebration of technological progress as an unproblematic goal. Nevertheless, he did come close to this general principle in a newspaper article he wrote in 1878, while the bridge was still under construction, entitled "On Manhattan Bay." where he talks about to the left of the North River with its far vista, near 3 or 4 warships anchored peacefully, the Jersey side, the banks of the Weehawken, and so on and so on. To the right, the East River, the mast-hemmed shores, the grand obelisk-like towers of the bridge, one on either side in haze, yet plainly defied, giant brothers twain throwing free, graceful, interlinking loops high across the tumbled, tumultuous current below. So this is as close as he comes to actually celebrating Brooklyn Bridge, which is kind of interesting given the fact that he is so famous for his earlier poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And while there's nothing negative in this description, it's a very meager yield in the work of someone who not only had already written an immortal masterpiece by the late 1880s or late 1870s about the bridge's predecessor, but also viewed the growing structure as an increasingly ubiquitous presence later in his life. This disdain of Whitman for the powerful inspiration latent in the image of the Brooklyn Bridge is indeed puzzling. But what is even more disturbing in the canon constructed out of these poets, and you'll find this all over literature now, must be the lack of any voices recorded by the many immigrants, the very figures we're talking about today, who made up the vast majority of bridge users in the early years after its construction. In 1905, in the middle period between Whitman's death in 1892 and the revival of images of the bridge in the works of Hart Crane and Garcia Lorca in the late 1930s, the Arab-American author Ameen Al-Rihani published a prose poem called On Brooklyn Bridge, celebrating a stroll he made across the aforementioned structure, concluding with an evocation of the iconic view of the Statue of Liberty, which will show up here in a little while. When you reach the end of the pedestrian walkway, that's what you see, is the Statue of Liberty. And my argument will be that this represents, in many ways, the missing link, Rihani's poem, between 1883 and 1930, the construction of the bridge, and Hart Crane's The Bridge, in the chronology of writing about Brooklyn Bridge, as well as articulating an alternative vision of the significance of the bridge that could only be produced by the imagination of a recent immigrant to American shores. And the poem begins with a vivid description, as vivid as anything produced, thank you, by Whitman or Crane, of the writer crossing at the pedestrian level. So I will allow you to look at that while I talk about what's going on there. Although the description has its roots in an unrelenting realism that considers no physical detail worthy of omission, the number and exact function, you'll notice, of the character of the pedestrians, the author sees in the course of his stroll, for example, the 2 policemen and the 1 solitary other individual. There's a hint in the reference to the narrow paths of life in line 7, telling us that we should interpret the bridge not just as a physical presence, but as a metaphor for the journey through each person's individual life. It is not a particularly striking or unusual metaphor. In fact, one could even characterize it as a dead metaphor, overly familiar to the reader, something that's characteristic of realism. But this is made up for in the fact that it is consummately functional. The journey across the bridge is equivalent to a journey through life, and even more, this individual course is of greater importance than a journey made with others. The journey constitutes an opportunity, in Rihani's eyes, for self-discovery and for the exercise of free will and the pursuit of happiness, if only in the form of greater physical health. And again, I'll let you look at Rihani's discussion of that here. While it may appear less than important at first that the speaker here focuses on physicality rather than spirituality, I would argue that this is the concern that marks it as an authentic immigrant voice. Immigrants were the ones who suffered the physical traumas of steerage in overcrowding, ill-maintained vessels to take them on the most important journey of their lives. And only someone who's lived through such an experience could clearly see how precarious one's physical well-being is and appreciate the power of the speaker's words. This is an example of how Rihani really gets inside the immigrant experience as part of his meditation on Brooklyn Bridge. Yet, on the other hand, the spiritual aspect in this poem is not neglected. As with many journeys, the significance of this journey only becomes apparent at its conclusion. So again, this is what you see at the end of the pedestrian walkway when you go across Brooklyn Bridge. And Rihani talks about this in this part of the poem, or of the prose poem, that to me is incredibly moving, but also predates the only other American canonical author, Marianne Moore, who talks about this when she says in her Granite and Steel in the following terms, "It's an enfranchising cable, silvered by the sea, of woven wire, grayed by the mist, and liberty dominate the bay, her feet as one on shattered chains, once whole links wrought by tyranny." So she was talking about the same thing, but not until 1966. And Rihani is talking about it in the early years of the 20th century, and I would argue this is because he is actually a poet of the immigrant voice. And I think I'll leave this here. Just one small observation talking about just how important this was to Arab authors and Arab students in the time. The chair of my department, the founder of the department, Farhat Ziada, did a 2005 interview with him in which he talked about how inspirational Brooklyn Bridge in particular was to him and his schoolmates. And he said that the poem was considered too subversive by the principal and some of the teachers in school in the 1920s. And we, the students, laid our hands on a copy of the Rihaniyat that we passed around and discussed at recess and after school. And this is how revolutionary ideas can actually take hold.
Thank you so much.